Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the Grime sisters case, which took place in Chicago in 1956 on December 28th. The Grime sisters were Barbara and Patricia. Barbara was 15 years old and Patricia was 12 years old. They lived in McKinley Park and they lived with their father, their mother who was called Loretta, their brother James who was 11, he was the youngest, Joey who was 14 and Teresa who was 17. Barbara attended Thomas Kelly High School and Patricia attended St. Maurice School. They were described as inseparable and they were huge Elvis fans. Everybody knew that they were huge Elvis fans. They were going to see the Elvis movie known as Love Me Tender. They'd already been to see it 10 times, so that should tell you how much of huge Elvis fans they were. So they were going to see it the 11th time. The movie was in Brighton Park, which was about a mile from where they lived. So they left to view the movie at 7:30 p.m. It was a double feature. They were expected to be back home by 11:45. Their mother had given them grace and said you can be home by midnight, but that's the latest. So when they got to the theatre, they were seen by a friend from school known as Dorothy Weinhurt. She was sat behind them. She left during the intermission between the double feature. She was with her little sister, and as they were leaving at 9:30 p.m. they saw the Grime sisters buying popcorn and they were laughing at this point, so there was nothing untoward, nothing had upset them. So when they didn't return by midnight, their mother sent Teresa, the 17-year-old, and Joey, the 14-year-old, to wait by the bus stop. After 3 consecutive buses came, the sisters hadn't come off at any of the buses, and so Teresa and Joey had waited long enough and went home to their mum. During this time, their mum Loretta had been trying to contact Barbara and Patricia's friends to see if they'd seen them or if they'd stopped at somebody's house. To no avail, nobody had seen them. So their mum filed a missing persons report at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. Elvis himself did a radio appeal and said, if you are huge Elvis fans, you will return home like good girls. Your family really miss you. In the coming weeks, it was really snowy. It was a really big snowfall. And then the snow thawed in mid-January of 1957. A man named Leonard Prescott, he was a construction worker. He went to work and he saw what he thought were mannequins at work, which he thought was funny. He thought it was really strange, but he thought it was funny that somebody had just dumped some mannequins there. So this was at Willow Springs on the 22nd of January along a deserted road where he saw these mannequins. He went home and told his wife that he'd seen these mannequins and she wanted to come and see them for whatever reason, and so he took her to where he had seen the mannequins. Upon arrival, his wife and him approached the mannequins, which they then realised were bodies. Leonard Prescott phoned the police straight away. The sisters were found completely nude and their clothes were actually never ever found. The police went straight to the scene. They saw Barbara's body, which had ice pick wounds to the chest and blunt force trauma as well. Patricia, she had bruises to both of her face and her body. So the police called their father to come and officially identify the bodies, which he did. And unfortunately, he found that, yes, they were his daughters. After they'd been officially identified, there was 160 police officers that showed up to investigate the crime scene. They had volunteers as well. After some investigation, the police thought that it was on their way home from the theatre that the Grime sisters had actually disappeared. It was thought that they were murdered and then driven to this location and placed behind a guardrail. They had gotten into a car willingly and then had been murdered and put there. At the crime scene, there was little to no evidence found. It's been said that maybe some of the volunteers, because they were untrained, that maybe they trampled over some evidence. The police didn't examine it before because they wanted all the help that they could get, so they asked volunteers to help, and so maybe some of the volunteers had trampled on the evidence. Any links that were found at the crime scene were never determined. So the bodies were taken for autopsy. There was 3 forensic pathologists that performed the autopsy. They could not agree on a date or a time of death. When they reviewed the stomach contents, they said that they had possibly died within 5 hours of their last sighting, which was at 9:30 p.m. when buying popcorn. So this would have been the late evening of December 28th or the early morning of December 29th. They said that the cause of death was murder and secondary shock because of such low temperatures. They did a toxicology report which showed no use of alcohol or drugs. They also found that there was no poison in their body. They found that Barbara had actually engaged in sexual intercourse as well. It was unknown whether this was consensual or not. They did say that there was no bruises or no evidence of violence if it had been non-consensual. It's still unknown to this day whether it was consensual or not. The police received an anonymous letter and it reads, "Outside the show we all got talking and we exchanged phone numbers. When we got to the street where we turned off, we said goodbye and we ran across the street. Then Betty forgot something. She had to tell Barbara. And we ran back to the corner. A man about 22 or 25 was talking to them. He pushed Barbara in the back seat of a car and then Pat in the front seat. We got part of the license number as the car drove by us. The first 4 numbers were 2184. Betty thinks there were 3 to 4 numbers after that. When we heard that they were missing, we did not know what to do." And this was sent to the police in January of 1957. Now, the unfortunate thing with this letter is that it was never authenticated. The author was never identified and the license plate was never traced, which obviously was quite unfortunate as it could have led to major leads in the case. So there were 3 major suspects in this case. So there was Edward Bedwell, also known as Benny. He was said to have resembled Elvis, but looking at that picture there, it doesn't really look like Elvis to me, but each to their own, I suppose. He worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant and he was seen with 2 girls resembling the Grime sisters on December 30th at the restaurant. The owners told the police on January 24th of 1957 when he realised that the girls were missing. They arrested Benny and interrogated him for 3 days straight. And unfortunately this happens quite a lot. They are interrogated profusely for days and days until eventually they admit to something either they've not done or they crack under the pressure and sign false confessions. It happens quite often, which is a really unfortunate thing because obviously the murderer may still be out there. So after 3 days of constant interrogation, he signed a 14-page confession. He said that he had an accomplice, which was William Cole Willingham. He said that him, William and the girls had been drinking on Madison Street, and he said that him and William had beaten them to death when they refused their sexual advances. The mother of the Grime sisters, Loretta, actually said that this was a lie because the girls didn't know where Madison Street was. Willingham came forward and said that he denied any involvement. He did admit to being seen with the 2 girls on December 30th who apparently resembled the Grime sisters, but he denied that they did, and so did Bedwell. Bedwell said that they didn't look like the Grime sisters either. Bedwell eventually withdrew his confession because he claimed that 4 days in custody was a long time and 3 days interrogation was even longer, and he thought that the police would release him if he signed the confession because that's what they told him apparently. Forensic evidence supported the withdrawal of the confession because the girls weren't beaten to death and there was no alcohol in their system as found in the toxicology report. Also, Bedwell had an alibi from clocking in at work on the day that the girls went missing. On February 6th, Bedwell was released from custody. He had somebody pay a $20,000 sum. Max Fleeg, he was a prime suspect due to his age. He was 17 years old at the time of investigation. Due to his age, he was unable to do an official polygraph test. However, he did volunteer to do an unofficial one. Now, apparently, when they were taking this polygraph test, he confessed that he had murdered the girls. However, he was released because there was no evidence and the unofficial polygraph test couldn't be used as evidence in court. He did actually get arrested a few years later for an unrelated murder. And then the final suspect was Walter Kranz. He was a self-proclaimed psychic. He called the police on January 15th and anonymously gave the location of the bodies where the girls could be found. When they did find the girls, they found them 1 mile from the location that Kranz had previously given them. They went back and traced the call and brought him in for interviewing. In the interview, Kranz explained that he'd seen it in a dream. He said that he'd been heavily drinking, and in this dream, he had seen the girls at the location that he'd previously given. So the police thought they might have had something to do with it. They got handwriting experts on the case because the Grime sister's mother, Loretta, had been given a ransom note. It was found his handwriting was similar. However, there was no evidence to suggest that he actually did write it. He was released after multiple interrogations. The mother, Loretta, she believed that it was someone they knew because she said they were smart girls and they wouldn't just get in a car with a complete stranger. Sadly, she passed away in 1989, never knowing who was responsible for the death of her daughters. And James, the youngest brother, who was 11 at the time, he said in 2013 that he still has hope that this will be solved one day, and it is still an open case. Any information needs to go to Chicago Police Department and see if we can get it solved.